all books in China in private hands were burned in the Cultural Revolution. And the libraries, the schools were closed. I was in my second year in the secondary school, aged 14, when the Cultural Revolution started, and this schooling was stopped, and the school and pupils were going to school and having no lessons. So they were, wandering around. They were smashing up, and they sort of anything that was considered culture and old. My school was founded in 141 BC. It was the oldest public school in China. And so we had a lot of things in the school. There was a Confucius, there was a temple for Confucius, and all that was smashed, and the pupils were going around, smash the heads out of the statues. And there was a huge tablet in poetry recording the life of Confucius. And the boys were trying to pull it down. They couldn't. So they had to get a lot of workmen from the outside for them to help them to pull down that great tablet. So the school was vandalized, a wasteland. And then they started to torture and torment the teachers. So the school was the most horrible place. Now, I spend most of the time at home, and because my parents were in detention, and I helped my grandmother look after my brothers, particularly my youngest brother, who was 5 at the time, 4, 5, and 6, and I looked after him, and sort of try to look after our parents. And sometimes when there were denunciation meetings against them, I went and sat in a crowd. It was really horrifying because this hysterical crowd was screaming blood-curdling slogans against, on this particular occasion, my mother. But I steeled myself up to be, telling myself to be brave. I sat through that. I sat at the place where my mother could see me. So she knew there was somebody in the crowd who loved her. And then my mother got very ill. So I remember getting up, at 3 o'clock in the morning to go to the only hospital that was working to queue to get a number to see a doctor, and learn to do injections for her. So I really basically didn't have a normal teenage, but just, thrown into sensible adulthood. And Red Guards would raid people's houses. And if they discovered books, no books basically were allowed except Mao's Little Red Book, his selected works, and the works of, the communist leaders like Marx and Engels, Lenin and Stalin. They were allowed, and a few other names. And outside this tiny group of books, all the other books were burned across China in great bonfires. Yeah, I did see the books were burnt everywhere. Everybody saw it. Well, if you looked. But in my family, my flat, our flat was constantly raided, and a lot of books were taken away to be burned in the garden, in the courtyard. But we had a lot of books, and they couldn't take everything away. It just would take too much time. My father had a lot of books, and when the Red Guards couldn't take away all his books, they ordered him to burn the rest of his books, and otherwise he would be beaten and tortured. And one day I came home and I saw my father had lit a bonfire in the kitchen sink, which was made of cement. And he was hurling his books into that sink. And while he was weeping, but basically howling in a kind of way I'd never seen. I was so terrified, and I hugged my father from behind him, and my father was stamping his feet and hitting his head on the wall. And that was the beginning of his nervous breakdown, and he went insane after that. But in the Cultural Revolution, I was able also to read over 1,000 foreign and Chinese classics. And the reason was that I had a very entrepreneurial 13-year-old brother who had discovered a black market selling books. Some people who didn't want their books to be confiscated or burned would sell their books very cheaply at this black market. And some Red Guards, after they took people's books away, they didn't want to burn them. They also sold these books at this black market. So my brother was able to build up a big collection. He made his money dealing in the Mao badges. In those years, to build up his personality cult, Mao ordered billions of badges with his head on them to be produced in China. There were several billions of badges around in China in those years, and we had to wear them at all times. And so the badges were made of different materials like porcelain or aluminum, and the images of Mao were also different. So some people then started to collect the Mao badges, and it became a collector's item. My brother had loved collecting stamps, but when the Cultural Revolution started, all collecting was condemned as a bourgeois habit. So he couldn't collect the stamps. And so his interest in collecting stamps turned to this sanctioned item, the Mao badges. So there was also a black market in Chengdu, the city where we were, in Southwest China. There was a black market dealing in the Mao badges. So my brother was very active on that black market, and he became a connoisseur in the Mao badges, and he made a small fortune. And with that money, he bought books on the black market selling books. And he brought these books home. He found a corner in a sort of waste, and sort of waste water tower, old abandoned water tower, and he hid his collection there. And every couple of days he dug out a few books and brought them home. Sometimes we tore up the cover of collected works of Mao and stuck the cover on these banned books that were destined to be burned, and I was able to read them. And so I was, reading those books, of course, kept me sane in the Cultural Revolution. Even writing for oneself was dangerous. I wrote my first poem on my 16th birthday in 1968. I was lying in bed polishing my poem when I heard the door banging. Red Guards had come to raid our flat. And if they saw my poem, I would get into trouble and my family would get into trouble. So I had to quickly rush to the bathroom to tear up my poem and flush it down the toilet. And that ended my first venture in writing. But the desire to write never left me. And in the following years, when I was exiled, to the edge of the Himalayas and worked as a peasant, and when I was later working as an electrician and checking electricity supplies on top of the electricity poles, I was always writing in my head with an imaginary pen, but I couldn't put pen to paper. And then I came to Britain in 1978. And I could write whatever I wanted to write. But at that moment, the desire to write left me because I had come to this completely new world, this fantastic world, the freedom, the sense of liberation, the excitement. So I just wanted to spend all my time absorbing the new atmosphere, the new society. So I didn't want to write. And also to write would mean for me to look backward and inward into a past I didn't want to think about. My father died in the Cultural Revolution, my grandmother died, and their deaths were the most painful spot in my heart. And so I didn't want to think about writing. Then in 1988, my mother came to London to stay with me. For the first time, she told me the stories of her life, the life I didn't know, stories of my grandmother, her relationship with my father. And once my mother started, she couldn't stop. She stayed with me for 6 months and she talked every day. And by the time she left London, she had left me 60 hours of tape recording. And when I was listening to my mother, I kept saying to myself, I've got to write this down. And then I realized how much I wanted to be a writer and how much I had always wanted to be a writer. And it also seemed to me that my mother seemed to know I had cherished this unspoken dream, and she was trying to help me to fulfill my dream. Because when I was working at the SOAS, London University, and when I was out working, my mother talked into a tape recorder. And so after my mother was gone, I transcribed her tapes and I thought about my own life and I started writing Wild Swans. When I wrote Wild Swans, it was a very straightforward thing. I mean, it took for a fairly big book, it was actually quite amazing. It took me only 2 years to write. And also I was working at SOAS, London University at the time. So I guess a lot of the stories had been in my head again and again. When I was working as a peasant and spreading manure in the paddy fields, and when I was checking electricity supplies on the electricity poles, I mean, these stories were there. I had been writing them. And so it was like a floodgate being opened. The memories and the stories just rushed out. My grandmother, of course, I mean, I even today, I mean, when we talk about them, I find, quite painful. I mean, particularly because, I mean, all through her life, she had crushed up and bound feet. Her, only the big toe was allowed to grow. The 4 toes and the arch were crushed under a big stone to produce what they call 3-inch golden lilies, a ghastly Chinese tradition that had tortured women, Chinese women, for more than 1,000 years. So from that, all her, then when she was 15, she was given by her father to a warlord general to be his concubine. My grandmother, only saw him a few times, and the rest of the time, because he had many concubines in other places, and my grandmother lived as a virtual prisoner in a house he bought for her, and she had no freedom she couldn't walk out of the house freely. And then she had, my mother was a young communist and married my father, and they had their clashes, my grandmother and my father. And then the Cultural Revolution, to see my mother being tortured and paraded in the streets and so on, and so my grandmother died for her age, very prematurely. So I feel great pain for my grandmother. I love her very much, and then I also feel very. I noticed some reviewer and said I seem to have a lot of feeling about my father. I mean, indeed, I think the passages about my father's insanity were the most important, most difficult passages to write. And I also, because he was such a tragic figure, and because he joined the communists when he was a teenager, and he had such hopes that they would bring a better China and they would get rid of poverty. And he had, then after he married my mother, and he always put the interests of the party behind his family. And that was the problem between them and between him and my grandmother. And he was he was incorrupt to a fault. And then he found, this, he had been betrayed by the sort of ideal, whatever, the ideal that he believed so much in, and that betrayal had destroyed him. He died of a heart attack. And so I found him, I was his favorite. I knew him very well when I was a teenager. Everything he taught us was about principles, being incorruptible, being true. So that was also very, very, I felt very strongly about my father. And also my aunt, Jung, who was a Buddhist and was just incredibly wonderful person. I mean, I think in China, there aren't anyone like that now, in a kind of extremely materialistic, money-driven and moral, of low morality. There were just not people like my aunt and my father, for that matter. And my mother, of course, I mean, she told me a lot of the stories, and she was like a heroine, but she's a survivor. And so I think of her with a different feeling, not so much a great pain, because she is aged 92 at the moment. She is still the tower of strength for me.